So when it comes to ethics of ongoing management of information systems, right? Then, right? So this is what we were exactly just talking about, right? That a long-term comprehensive view of system use is therefore important. And right, there are all these ethics by design approaches. That okay, you try and design your technology, right? Keeping all of these points in mind: user interface, data, algorithm, system design, all of that, right? So that's the first thing that we look at. That however, this design process itself has to be managed carefully, right? That how well have you really managed to model the world? So that's the first thing we look at. And then after that, we'll get to the second part, that once you've managed to keep a good design process, right? You've tried to model as much of the world that you can. Even then, you will never be perfect, and therefore you need management beyond the design process when the technology is actually deployed, right? So that's the second part that we look at. So I've basically just divided into right two parts, right? One is, and the first part we look at it in more detail later, right? That how do we manage this design process itself, right? And one way to do it is to do it together with the users, because unless you're not doing that, unless you're not getting feedback from the users of your technology, right? Then and you're not incorporating that in the design, you'll never know, right, where you're going wrong, right? So this part where you're comparing your design with how well is it actually able to work, right? The step 5 in that soft systems methodology we just saw, right? Right, that's where you need users to step in. Yeah, right. So now one of the best methods that or cutting edge kind of method that does exist is something called value sensitive design. So here what they say is that, right, think about certain values, right? Now, and they give a list of 18 values or so, right? Like privacy, property rights, physical welfare, freedom for bias, and so on, right? And these are values that people consider important for life. So I'll come back to this. Yeah. So, and you want to incorporate these values in your design, right? Right. And how can you do that? Well, you need to influence the design early on. You need to be iterative, right? So that you understand what is right, what's happening. You need to discover what values are important for people, and you need to iteratively in your design, you need to incorporate these values so that you're able to reflect these values in a better and better way. Don't just focus on usability, look at human values, right? Map direct and indirect stakeholders, identify harms and benefits for each, right? So this is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about system design. Yeah, some values may be universal, pay special attention to those, and there may even be conflict between values. And here again, we've seen values like accountability versus privacy, environmental sustainability versus economic development, efficiency via hierarchy versus authoritarian control due to hierarchy, right? So all of these are, we know that there can be conflicts between these values. So again, right, consultation with the users is important, right? So use participatory methods to resolve conflicts and build lists of values. Be explicit about the context in which these value lists were developed, right? Because in different contexts, different values might become more important. And distinguish between values of the designers and users, right? So here again, right, very early on, you remember we saw a paper called, right, Power, that where designers have more power over the users, and we saw how they should, right, really consider them as unspecified users, like Rawls' veil of ignorance, so that designers do not push their value on the users, right? But rather it's all about discovering these values of the users and to incorporate them in the design itself so that these values are not violated, right? So this is basically what they say. And how do you discover these values? How do you discover what values are important for users? So they say that you can do it in 3 ways. And right, so this paper, you can see it gives examples, right? So one is that you can discover them empirically, that you build something and then you see how people view it. So I won't go into the details, but like, so this is actually a very old paper, right? Value sensitive design. The concept was developed almost 20 years back. And it's still one of the best methods of trying to discover values of users and to include them. So here, one of the examples they give is that in hospital rooms, now not all rooms can have windows, but patients want to look outside. So they put up plasma screens, which were basically plugged into the CCTV cameras of the hospitals, right? So the hospital had a lawn outside, and where families of patients could come, they could relax in these lawns or something of that sort. And there were plasma screens that people who were in the rooms, the patients in the rooms, could then get a view of what's going outside. Right. So the idea was that, well, this will make them feel happier. And then they saw that, well, but it also conflicts with values of privacy, for example, of the people outside. Does it really lead to emotional well-being or not? So you measure that. Does it have actually a good effect on physical health or not if there are these plasma screens instead of actually windows, right? So anyway, the point is that once you design something, once you prototype something, then you can empirically discover what values are actually emerging, and are people, right? Do they respect these values? Do they actually want these values or not? Right? Or you can discover then conceptually where, so here what they did was they looked at privacy policies of many websites in terms of how they treat cookies, and that gave them different axes, that, right, different browsers, they give different information about what their policies tell you about what information they keep private, what information is divulged with third parties. Like we discussed these examples of Chrome and Firefox, right? So in Firefox, your browser is your browser. All your data is private to you. But with Chrome, it is Google's browser, and all your data, whatever you do on your browser, is shared with Google, right? Right. So it's different setups. Of course, this was done even before that, but same sets of issues arise, right? Right. You can also look at it technically, where they built a software for urban simulation, and then this led to debates among people that how should the software be designed, right? So even before you actually design, you can do these kinds of debates, right? Right. So the broad paradigm really that we're trying to discuss is that to do design well, you need to manage the design process itself. And one way is this method called value sensitive design, which says that you discover what values people hold important. And you can do this conceptually, empirically, or technically, and you use participatory methods to do all this. Yeah. And the same people also, right, right, another paper of theirs talks similarly about that even though you design machines, even though you might design these value sensitive machines, you should not delegate responsibility entirely to them, right? Because what this process is actually telling you is that it's not the machine which is doing anything. It's actually you who have coded, who have implemented some of these values, who have coded these values into the machine. So the agency rests actually with people. Agency is not with the machines, right? If more authority is given to machines, then humans will lose their own self-importance over time. Yeah. This is exactly also what Joseph Weizenbaum, right? So now remember, right, we discussed this when we were talking about ELIZA, right, which is one of the first chatbots that was developed. And Joseph Weizenbaum then wrote this book. So the book basically then talks about exactly this, that certain things. So he takes the view that he basically makes categories, that certain activities should not be given to machines at all, right? Like, right, machines should not. You should not make applications which right have machines replicate something like human love or certain emotions. And this is exactly similarly what Bhatia, Friedman, and Kahn are saying over here. That even though you might design these machines through consultative processes and everything, right? But even then you should not give over your agency to them, right? Seek to protect the moral agency of humans because they are the ones who need to take responsibility. And discourage in humans a perception of the moral agency lying with the computational system, because this basically creates a moral buffer, right? So again, we've looked at these points earlier. So these papers are essentially echoing those same points, right? So they say we'll do non-anthropomorphic design, which means that technology should not mimic human processes, right? So remember, we also looked at it. We also discussed critically when we were talking about AI, where there are a whole class of papers which talk about how to make AI more acceptable. And they say that, well, the more AI is human-like, it will be more acceptable to people. So this is taking a completely opposite stand. They say that you should not do that, right? People should recognize what are machines and what are humans. You should not make technology invisible. In fact, you should sharpen the boundaries between people and computers. And do not delegate decision-making, use computers as consultants. Here also, we know that it is not straightforward. Yeah. So remember, right? So we looked at this paper which studied that humans who are given who are shown the output of risk scores of criminal recidivism, what decisions do they make versus humans who are not shown these risk scores, right? So even though you might use them as consultants, even that has an effect, yeah. And even that affects. So here also we saw that it wasn't solving the stereotype of people considering blacks as more prone to recidivism than white, right? So even this is not perfect, but yeah, this is a good starting point, right? That okay, these are certain things that you can model in your design. That don't do non-anthropomorphic design, do not make technology invisible, do not delegate decision making. So these are some guidelines, right? And of course, right, follow these processes when you're designing technology, right? Through user interactions, through participatory methods, so that you're able to understand, right, what values are you really coding into the technology. And now to do all that, of course, means that, right, so the reason why we're talking about it over here is that it's about managing the design process. It's about, right, keeping all these points in mind when you're designing the technology itself, right? So that you're embedding the right values into the technology. Yeah. So you got it? Any doubts on this? Any questions?
So what is non-morphic design here?
So anthropomorphic means human-like, right? So non-anthropomorphic is that the technology should not pretend that it's a human, right? Right. So as an example, right, chatbots, right? Chatbots are where, or like Amazon Siri of Apple, Amazon Alexa, right? All of these things are right. So it's trying to give a view that, right, Siri is a human, Alexa is a human, right? So right. So they all of these people, Friedman, for example, similarly, Weizenbaum, they advise against it, that these things should not be done because people, right? So remember we talked about this psychologist from Stanford, Fogg, his first name I can't remember, B. Fogg, who showed how people perceive of computers as social actors, right? So even to the extent the color of the computer monitor's frame, and whether you're right, so it's a red color and you're in a red team, you start attaching a greater affinity with machines, right? So basically, there's a lot of evidence from psychology and all these fronts that people tend to relate to machines as they would to other humans. And anthropomorphic design will basically make them do more and more of that, right? So rather, we should try to prevent that. We should try that computers are seen as computers and not as humans. Yeah. So that's the argument over here. Because if you start doing that, it's a slippery slope, right? Ultimately, you'll end up giving more and more agency. You'll end up surrendering more and more agency to computers. You'll start creating these moral buffers that you won't take responsibility, but you'll pass it down to the computer system, right? So this is where, for example, right, Facebook says that, well, we didn't do anything, our algorithm is responsible. Now we're trying to fix the algorithm, right? Well, so they say that, well, that's not a good argument, right? Because you are the one who designed the algorithm in the first place, right? You're the one who has coded certain objectives in the algorithm which maximize user engagement rather than content diversity, for example, right? So that's the idea. That the more anthropomorphic design you do, the more you make technology invisible, or the more you delegate decision making, you start putting more and more agency in the hands of machines, right? That's not what should be done. Right? That's the idea.
Should we follow these guidelines, or these guidelines are just views of these authors, or are these the ideal guidelines from this perspective?
Yeah, I mean, these are recommendations, right, that these people are making. Now you can argue that they're incorrect, right? So that's, I mean, there's no law, right, which says that this shouldn't be done, but these are recommendations made by these authors. Yeah, but I mean, people also challenge them, right? So one example that's often considered is that assistive technologies can be anthropomorphic. I don't completely buy that, but that's one argument that is typically made. Assistive technologies in the sense that, right, helping visually impaired people, helping those with mental health issues or genetic disorders like Down syndrome and so on, right? So over there, many people are not able to relate to humans emotionally. Over there, machines can be a better substitute. So that's one space, for example, where people say that, well, it should be, right, machines are more suitable for some of these interactions. So now to do all this, right, to build these participatory environments, then another fantastic paper is, right, so all of these things are known, right, for a long time. Lucy Suchman, who talks about the process of technology production itself, and how, right, in today's world, the way technology systems are done is that there's teams of engineers who sit in the office, then there's teams of designers who basically interface with the users, and they bring back user insights based on which they draw requirements, and the engineers basically just follow those requirements. But these things are influenced a lot. So we'll revisit this in more detail when we talk about organizational structure. That this is how it's supposed to work in theory, right? But actually, it may not, because the designers may filter out certain things. They might have different notions of what's technically feasible or not. A really genuine discussion that could have happened is often not done, where the technologists can also inform about what's technologically feasible or not, or they can think of ways to improve their systems. And this consultation then needs the technology people and the designers and the users to be in the same room and to discuss and talk about all of this. But right, Lucy Suchman says how the current paradigm of division of labor in organizations, that is actually creating more and more silos, because of which this user designer gap keeps increasing. It keeps increasing. The technology is not able to really provide what it can provide to users, and it also makes it harder to place accountability. Yeah, right. So this is one of the other arguments that, right, you might want to do all this. You might want to influence design early on and embed values in all of that, right? But in the modern work environment, that's typically hard. And in fact, it's becoming harder and harder with new, even with things like globalization, because now what globalization has encouraged is outsourcing, and therefore it's just creating more and more divisions, more and more units, which are basically moving people, moving the designers and the technologists further apart from each other. Everybody is just doing their own work according to certain specifications, and it doesn't lead to an environment where these values can be discovered that users want and shaped accordingly, right? So she basically talks about, right, how we need to get inside the black box. We need a new culture of work that embraces integration between devices and the settings of their use, right? Not just on creation of devices. Yeah. So that's another view that is important, and we look at this in more detail as we go along, right? Challenges, for example, in creating user participation, right? Especially, let's say, in environments where users do not have that much time, right? So if you want to build technologies for users in developing countries, right? But over here, people may not have the time to give to designers because they have to earn their daily bread and butter. They can't take time off, right? So building processes for this participation might be hard. Similarly, the organization itself, the organizational structure itself might be making it hard to bring all of this together. Yeah. So the point is that, therefore, user participation, user interaction is very necessary for design. The design process has to be managed to incorporate it, but we need to keep in mind that participation from users is hard, and the organizational structure itself makes things difficult. Similarly, another aspect that influences all of this is something called affordances, right? So we mentioned affordances very early on in some of the classes. So basically what it means is that the technology, the way the technology is designed, it could constrain certain types of behavior, or it could be flexible so that it can be, right, people can do different things with it. Different use cases can be developed by the people, right? So in general, you'd say that affordances should be very open. People should be able to create their own use cases that will lead to better technology adoption, right? But there are also downsides to it, because it could also lead to misuse, right? So this is, for example, what we've seen a lot with social media, right? That free sharing of content on the one hand has been good for democratic purposes by giving power to people to share content and everything. But on the other hand, the systems being very open have also meant that they've also been used for disinformation. They've also been used for one-sided political campaigns, and it's really more of an arms race, right? That who's able to get more users, who's able to build these connections first, so that they're able to reach more and more users through these systems, right? So the point is, therefore, in the design process itself, right, this is affordances is another aspect to keep in mind, because, and again, you may not get it right all the time, right? But the motivation and intention of the people shapes what actions they will choose, right? Not all people may necessarily choose the same action. Individuals may respond differently to these affordances, and right. So ultimately, it's about what all choices can people make in terms of how they use the technology. Yeah. So ultimately, all of these points, right, that you do need these values to be embedded. You can think of good methods for participatory design, and we'll look at some of these methods soon enough, right? But this is not very straightforward. Getting users to participate is difficult. Organizational structures also make it difficult. Plus, you may not always get these affordances right, and it will lead to misuse, right? So you need to manage the design process well, but it needs management beyond the design itself. So I hope this part is therefore now clear. That so try to put all of it together, right, in your head, of how we've thought about design in terms of user interfaces, data privacy, algorithm, system design. And to get all of this, we look in more detail at participatory processes and how can we understand and discover values of users and try to embed those values in the technology, right? But getting user participation can be challenging. Organizational structures can make it harder for you to understand what users need. Affordances again can make it hard for you to for the design to be correct and to do what it was intended to do, right? And that therefore brings us to the second part, which is management beyond the design process. Yeah. So the common term that you hear these days a lot, right? Especially if you pick up any government consultation document, right? It always has, right, very cliched term now, privacy by design, right? Of course, none of these consultations actually talk, or none of these papers go into any technical depth as to what they mean by privacy or how they're supposed to, how they will guarantee privacy by design. But right, a broader term, even more right broader than that, is ethics by design. That you've embedded your ethics in the technology. So the point is, you might have managed a design process well to do as good a job as you can by modeling, by embedding ethics into design. But the argument is that that alone is not sufficient, right? It's a complex world with many unknowns. Affordances can lead to misuse or unexpected situations. Getting this design, even though you might manage the design process, doing it correctly is not easy. Yeah. So now we will get into some of these case studies on right, how can or what methods can be used to manage the design, manage the deployment of the technology, right? After it has been designed, how do we manage the deployment of the technology so that it continues to preserve certain values? There are certain ethics which are preserved, right, beyond the design. Because the point that we've basically tried to show all along is that you can do as good a job as you can on all the other fronts, but you will need to do even more beyond the initial design. Yeah. I had uploaded this talk of mine, which I had referred very early on in the class. You can take another look at that. So here I talk about my own experiences with Gramvani. And right, so the idea over there, right, you can think of it similarly, that we designed voice-based technology so that it could be accessible even to less literate people. It could work on simple phones, so they didn't have to, right, they didn't need the internet, or they didn't need smartphones. It was also free of cost, right, so they didn't have to even pay for the calls, right? So all that was great, but we saw that this was all at the design stage, right? But once we deployed this, we saw that we had to very carefully manage these technologies as well, so that they did not reproduce existing social inequities, right? So I talk in more detail over there, right? And this paper, Limits of Design, talks exactly about this argument, right? That what we saw, right? I'll just very quickly go through this, right? That what we saw was that women, for example, were not able to use the technology because of existing social inequities. They did not have access to phones, or if they did, well, we did not have access to them. We were not able to reach women and tell them about these systems because public spaces where we can approach women, right, they didn't exist. Similarly, caste issues. We recruited volunteers from the ground who could further facilitate technology adoption. Right. So even though this technology is simple to use through IVR, interactive voice response, even then not everybody knew how to use it. And that's why we built an entire offline structure and very elaborate incentive mechanisms so that volunteers recruited from the same community could actually tell and demonstrate the technology to other people in the community of how they can use it. But the choice of volunteers also meant that volunteers would typically go to their own communities, right? There were caste issues, for example, where certain lower caste groups were not being able to come online because the volunteers were not reaching them. So we had to work harder in terms of identifying volunteers, being more representative, that the volunteers themselves were from diverse caste groups and they had that ethos. So we had to do volunteer selection more carefully, right? Of how we can do all that, right? Similarly, we had to build processes so that we would regularly survey users, we would regularly be in the field to really understand what is it that they need, so that we can redesign the technology or we can train the volunteers in better ways, right? So there was this, right, what we were just talking about, right? That creating user participation is hard. So we had to develop ways so that we could listen more from the users and redesign the technology and the content and everything on over the technology. Right, then in terms of controlling misuse, right, because ultimately what we are doing over here is essentially a voice-based social media platform, right, that people can call, they can record messages, which could be, they could be asking questions, they could be reporting some news, they could be giving an opinion about some local news or opinion about policy matters or social issues. And it is obviously subject to misuse, just like Facebook or anything. So how do we control that? And this is where we'll talk about moderation, content moderation in more detail, but this is where we had to develop all these very elaborate content moderation guidelines so that we would encourage diversity. And the way we did it, for example, is we would make sure that different viewpoints were highlighted on the platform. And sometimes we would also, if those viewpoints were not coming organically, the volunteers would conduct interviews of different stakeholders to bring more diverse responses on different discussions that we were doing, right, on early marriage, on domestic violence, and so on, right, to hear from more and more people about why these practices prevail. Yeah. And similarly, with the volunteers, we had to build methods to create solidarity among them. So and that was very helpful because it reduced our volunteer attrition. So we built structures where groups, we organized groups of volunteers at the district level who would meet once a month, and that helped and solve problems together, and that helped build a very strong solidarity among them, which provided an incentive, right? Not a monetary incentive, right? But essentially a solidarity incentive for them to work together as a team. They enjoyed working together. Yeah. So there were many such things. Similarly, going beyond the technology and processes to manage the technology, but also how do we make sure that the technology is actually bringing impact? And this required us to connect with local government departments, build credibility for ourselves before we could expect the governments, departments, and everybody to take us seriously. So we had to work very hard on all of these offline partnerships as well. Yeah. So the point, therefore, ultimately is that the design of the technology itself was a very small part, right? The bigger challenges were during the management stages, that we built the technologies, and yeah, it was all good, easy to use, and all of that, but and we built processes also around the technology, right, of recruiting volunteers and training them and all of that, right, to facilitate adoption even by less tech savvy users. right? But then we had to make sure that these were not amplifying social inequities. We had to make sure that we were listening to the users. We had to make sure that we were sending the right signals to control accountability, to bring accountability, to build a respect for the medium. And we had to work on cultivating partnerships, relationships, to gain credibility and to ultimately actually impact people through the technology. Yeah. So all of this is therefore going much beyond the technology design itself, right? Whatever we could have done on the user interface or treatment of data and so on, right? All of this is therefore on the management side of the technology. Yeah. So that it leads to, right, the outcomes that we wanted it to lead to, and doesn't amplify inequalities and so on. Yeah. Now, very similar things have been, you'll hear of this in many different contexts. So Arturo Escobar wrote this very famous book called Encountering Development, where, right, he basically, again, right, just like Rittel and Weber were talking about dilemmas, right, their paper was called Dilemmas in the Theory of Planning, Dilemmas with the Theory of Planning, that you can plan and it will work, right? So the notion of development itself, right, Escobar basically says that this is about the global north imposing whatever it thinks is developed, right? Whatever it means that developed countries should do, right? Like cars or having standardized vegetables in the grocery shops and so on, right? So that's what it considers as development, and it's imposing this view of development on the global south, right? So this is not working out, right? That's what he basically says, that this notion of development has failed us again and again. That it's a right. The problem was defined by experts from the global north based on their imprecise notions, without having understood the local culture, traditions, and complexities of social relationships in the global south. Right? And then he gives many such examples, and I'm sure all of you are aware, right? You've been reading about this in the newspapers on and off, right? So this is just about putting it under that one bucket, right? Destruction of tribal ways of living, right? Destruction of forests and so on, right? And why? Well, because somebody is defining, right, that living off forests is not done. It's underdeveloped, right? A developed notion is living in houses, living in cities, right? Having access to various amenities and so on. Right? But whereas it's done away with the tribal ways of living, which were through a oneness with nature, right? Where concepts of the circular economy were already there, right? And which now this notion of development is now rediscovering, right? Even though all of these things are systematically destroyed, right? It doesn't, similarly, importance of relationships over individuals, right? Many societies, right, over there, the individual is not considered as important, right? Rather, so we've talked about Marx, for example, right? Marx said that humans by nature are shaped by and want to create positive social relationships with other people. And how do they create these positive social relationships? They do it through production, right? So when somebody produces something, a good or a service, and somebody else consumes it, and this good or service is actually fulfilling some use value for the consumer, so that actually creates a positive social relationship. And right, so it's these relationships, therefore, which are more important than individuals. But notions of economic development actually do it the opposite way, right? Here, the individual selfish, rational behavior is considered to be more important than anything else, right? And whatever relationships are shaped are because, well, you're doing something for your own gain, right? Right. So Escobar gives all of these different examples and basically says that, right, it's a right that this notion of development, it very simply, right, in a very simplistic manner, it models the local context, and it uses a rationalist lens. Rationalist lens is again something, right, we've mentioned again and again, of the world being modeled accurately and behaving according to certain laws of nature, rationalist laws that have been discovered, right? And you might bring community involvement, but it is in a very, right, so that you're not really imposing your own notion, that you might bring community development, but it is not done in any genuine manner. Rather, what the view that you're actually enforcing is that it is possible to master nature. It is possible to objectify nature, and this is what modernity is called. right? That modernity is about achieving mastery over nature. So all of this thought about development is being done that you can master, you can control nature, you can control how the world works. It behaves in rationalist ways, and you will then be able to gain through, you will get developed if you follow this whole process. Yeah. So Escobar basically says that, well, just like we've been talking about when it comes to, right, ethics by design, that design alone is not sufficient. So here we see the same thing, but in a being said in a different context. That this notion of development itself is being inspired by this design mindset, by this planning mindset, but you always get it wrong, right? And in fact, what we'll see later on is that there's a political economy behind this, right? The reason why this view is being pushed, largely it is creating a dependency of the global south on the global north, right? So things like loans, IMF loans, World Bank loans, which create a dependency, and which are basically done so that notions of development of the West are what are or of the global North are what are adopted by the global South countries, and they essentially are given loans to adopt these processes, to adopt these views and work according to that, right? Right. So something called the Washington Consensus is again where the use of technology is considered as essential for development, right? So loans are given so that global South countries absorb technologies that were built in the global North. So it increases their dependency, plus they're forced to adopt these notions of development, and which ultimately don't end up working, right? Which ultimately just lead to more impoverishment, more inequality, right? So that's what Escobar talks about, right? But in our context, the main takeaway is that this notion of the supremacy of being able to design, being able to plan, right? That is mistaken, right? It might be done for vested interests of the global north, but the method itself is not really working out. Yeah. Similarly, James Scott, right? James Scott is an anthropologist. He wrote this book called Seeing Like a State. And he talks about many mechanisms, right, that were built by the state to enforce control and to coordinate human behavior. But many of these things fail. So he gives many examples like industrialized agriculture, like the Green Revolution, things like monoculture in forests, where you're right, palm tree plantations, for example, where you destroy forests and you plant just one species, and it reduces biodiversity. Similarly, urbanization itself, where you build cities according to a particular structure that makes it more observable, makes it more controllable. And right, so while all of this was done by the state to to be able to coordinate and control populations, but all of these methods end up failing. And so he talks about why that happens. So a lot of that happens because, well, like in industrial agriculture, you hadn't, right, people hadn't really, it's just imprecise modeling, right? Hadn't realized other ramifications on the environment of like extensive fertilizer use, extensive pesticide use, or like with forests, monoculture of forests, right? The impact that this taking away biodiversity has on people. Similarly, on urbanization, that if you create these very artificially, very contrived spaces, it impacts how people interact, it impacts innovation, right? So all of these things are what the government, what the state had not considered. So these are other examples again of how careful planning can go wrong, right? Careful planning done with a particular objective can go wrong, right? So again, broadly, it's about a criticism of this design or planning mindset, in be it in terms of what is called, right, notions of development, or over here in the name of national security, and similarly, right, social welfare, how systems of control actually end up failing. Yeah. So so broadly, all of them are talking about, right, similar things, and therefore, right, if you have user involvement in these things, that's probably one way to avoid, right? So maybe then you wouldn't make silly mistakes of ignoring, right, what is the culture, what are the social relationships which should not be destroyed, and they're there for a particular reason. They're there as a result of particular historical processes, and they should not be destroyed, right? Or similarly, right, creating these contrived spaces and how they take away local knowledge, local know-how, right? These things are important, right? So the reason why, right, we've emphasized, right, user involvement is again, right, coming back from, right, what we discussed with the value sensitive design, right, and that you need participatory processes to shape the design, but then you also need these participatory processes to keep, right, even after you do a good design, how do you keep managing the design going forward? Yeah. So that's the idea over here. So now we talked about content moderation, right, on social media platforms, for example. So this is right now you can say that, well, can I involve, and this is one space where users have been involved to manage the system. Yeah, we've acknowledged that not only do you need to involve users in the design of the system, but then once the system has been designed and it's up for use, even then you want to keep involving the users, right? So on content moderation, this is done because you have all of these features, like, right, this is on Pinterest, right? You can flag certain content, right? It's spam, there's nudity, violence, harm, attacks a group or individual, right? So there are certain categories that are given. Similarly, on Instagram, there are certain categories that are given where users can flag content, right? So all great, right? Because you're involving users in this activity. Policing is seen as a joint activity to preserve a space for self-expression. Yeah. Right. So this is one space where we've seen, right, all these experiments by involving users in the process. Yeah. Similarly, this is on YouTube. Again, similar stuff, right? That you can do something, right? You can give additional details. This is some other platform on research where you can report some of these issues if it's violating some things, right? No, okay, this is on Facebook that they violate our community standards. Okay, oh, okay, so this is being reported again on this group. So, but what are the limitations, right? So now that we've sort of accepted that you do need to involve users in the management, right? What are some of the limitations of this process that we should keep in mind? How can we involve users in the management after the deployment, after the design, right? How can we involve users in the management in meaningful ways, right? So this case study on content moderation, it brings up these kinds of issues. So one is that it's a constrained vocabulary. There are well-defined categories only, right? No flag to indicate that something is troubling, but nonetheless worth preserving. So very important, right? You can think of examples, right? That somebody is raising a view, maybe they've not written it properly, right? Maybe the language is coarse or whatever, right? But it is a view that is worth preserving, right? And you don't know, you're not just doing a binary, right? Remove or retain, but there are gradations to it, right? There's a gray area in between where you might want a different kind of treatment, right? Or similarly, forms of speech that may be threatening but are deemed necessary from a civic perspective, right? So again, right, a different way in which somebody might have, right, maybe somebody's spoken something in a threatening manner, but the point that they're making is important. Yeah. So on Gramani, actually, we also suffer from these things, and we've not solved, right? So I think this is actually, the criticism applies even to Gramani related platforms as well, because we impose a filter on the tone with which a message was spoken. So if it was spoken in a coarse manner, we remove it, right? But something that we can do better, right? We can consider how to do it better. Maybe, right, one thing that could be done is that if this content cannot be published as such, if it is, right, written in or spoken in a very coarse manner, while the point is important, well, maybe it should not be published as such, but maybe somebody can rewrite it, right? So, right, so the point is therefore that some of these categories which are given, right, child abuse, spam, infringes my rights, right? Now some of these are vague, right, like infringe my rights, or harmful or dangerous and harmful or abusive content. Some of these are quite subjective, right? Yeah, hate speech, for example, right? Some of these are quite subjective, right? So there should be ways that you're not just completely removing, but maybe you're flagging it in this gray area. Maybe somebody can rewrite it. Yeah. Disagreements, right? Because the point is that disagreements should also be opportunities for debate, right? So this is where we talk about agonistic spaces. Now, the way content moderation is done on these platforms, it is not leading to any debate, right? It is just about you flag certain content, and then maybe a moderator at Facebook will review it, and the moderator will just decide, right? Well, should I permit or should I reject, right? But neither is this final decision, neither is it exposed, right? Nor are these disagreements made open for debate, right? You just flag and that's it. That's all that you can do, right? You cannot discuss or debate with that should be written or done in a different way, right? No history is left of for future debates. It's like debates never happened, right? Even the content is removed, right? So not only did the debate not happen, well, that content itself was never published. That's the history that is being recorded, right? The final decision, which is then made by the moderators, makes it easy for the website to dismiss concerns whenever it feels like. No strong appeal procedures, and this non-responsive. Yeah. Now, some of you are working also on this Digital Media IT Act that India has brought up, right? So this is exactly some of the things that it raises, right? The law gives immunity to websites if they did not participate in the creation of offending content or lack knowledge, or they remove it in good faith if they or any users consider the content to be offending. Yeah. So this encourages both for the companies to not have knowledge, to not retain the knowledge, because that's how the law is, right? Because if the companies are retaining the knowledge, if the companies are retaining that, okay, there is some debate or something that is happening, right? Then it means that they're also liable for figuring out what to do with it, right? And therefore, just removing it altogether makes their job easier. Yeah. Any objection anybody might have, well, just remove it. So it encourages not to have, so that they avoid this liability, right? So the point is that it's great that it's been acknowledged, at least on social media websites, that you need to involve the users in ongoing management, right? But there are gaps. There are gaps in how this is done. Right now, if you compare it with Wikipedia, for example, Wikipedia has an agonistic character because all discussions on a particular content, right, how to write a sentence, what to write, what to remove, right, all of this is visible, right? There are fights, there are, right, various, right, of these oppositions that happen behind, right, happen at the backstage. So if you go to the Wikipedia history for some of the controversial pages, right, it's all there. Who's debating, who's pushing, and it at least lets you, right, if you want to view it, you can see, right, how that particular thing was debated, right? So which is different from how content is managed on social media platforms, right? So again, right, it's something to therefore view from the standpoint that how users should be involved in managing, right? There can be different ways to think about that. Yeah. So you can look at some of these links. So it's slightly tangential, but just like content moderation, right? Right, over the years, right? I think over almost the last 15 years or so, since when social media became so prominent, that it's gone through a journey, right? Earlier, the problem was not even acknowledged, right? Even with Mark Zuckerberg's statements and so on, right? You can see that earlier the problem wasn't even acknowledged, right? They were seen as bastions of free speech and anybody could say anything. But now gradually there is this tightening which is happening, that there are flagging procedures, and although issues have been highlighted with that, but at least it's acknowledged that users can be involved, and now things can be maybe made better. So this article actually is nice because it takes a completely different domain of basically adulteration in food, and it actually shows how it took almost a century, right? It took almost a century for society to figure out how to handle these things, right? Right. So earlier, for example, right, all these adulterations were used to strengthen the color of chocolates, cheese, and so on, right? Various things. Food quality was unregulated. Then gradually, right, people started collecting samples, understanding funds were needed for doing these, and then technology got better, right? Better tests were available. Okay, but regulation is still lacking. Well, now we do have these FSSAI and other kinds of regulations, right, for food. But that's the point, right? That to build for society to understand how to manage technology, how to manage new innovations, right? It takes time. It takes a long time. Is managing content? Yeah, yeah. Go.
Like in the previous example where we are comparing social media with Wikipedia. So like in the Wikipedia there is limited content, but in social media like there are so many posts on a daily basis. So like if everything is going to be debated, then like wouldn't it be hard for like even the users or even the content more like moderators to like
Yeah,
make this possible?
yeah. No, very true. No, but what question is that raising, right? The question that is raising fundamentally is what is the purpose of the technology, right? So if you're clear about the purpose, then it makes sense to then think about what's the right way to solve it, right? I mean, if the purpose of social media platforms is actually to have free speech to discuss political issues, then I think this should be done. Yeah, because right, it might reduce the number of users. Right, not everybody wants to talk about politics or discuss politics and so on. But then those who do, how can you make a good medium for those people? Right. So what is called a public sphere. So if Facebook says that our purpose in life is to be a public sphere to form genuine public opinion, then you would design it differently, right? So what is the goal of Facebook right now? It's not clear, right? It's because I mean partly they want to keep it ambiguous, right? Because it means that if it's ambiguous, it means it's hard to pin down, right? They can explore new markets, new spaces for social media, right? Sometimes photos, sometimes this, that, right? All sorts of things can keep happening. They can argue that well they're doing it for innovation, bringing out creativity of people, all of that, right? Usual stuff that you hear. Right, so there are business incentives to keeping it ambiguous. Yeah, very clear incentives in this case, right? Because if you constrain the use for a particular thing, like in Wikipedia, you've constrained the use for a particular thing, then it means that it you're constraining the market also for that particular technology, right? So I think that's the main answer to this issue, this point that you're raising. If the purpose of the technology is made clear, then you can think of what's the right way to go about doing it. Yeah, and then you would, so that will probably also address that, okay, well, if it is happening at a very large scale, then how do you do it? And people have talked about, right, how to architect good public spheres. So for example, Habermas, right, who's one of the biggest theorists on the public sphere, right? So he has this notion of federated public spheres, that right, debates happen in small groups, and then right, consensus is achieved, and those things bubble up to higher levels, right? Pretty much like, right, I mean, federated systems work, right? There's a network, local networks which identify issues, and right at each level then you have small debate groups, and that leads to right many of the insights coming together. Nothing is ignored because that's how that sphere at that level is governed, and you then arrive at some consensus broadly, or you arrive at different whatever conclusions you want. Yeah, so so if it's thought about from that way, then you can think about designing it, right, so that it preserves these issues. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So I think we should stop, right? But just to complete this point, right, that right content moderation itself, right, is going through, right, it should remain a very active area of research of how to right do it well, because as we've seen, right, similar things have taken many years for people to eventually find a solution, right? And there are many ways, right? Slashdot does it differently, Reddit does it differently, but there's also issues because this data is not made publicly available as such. So it's hard for researchers, for example, to really understand about what's going on and to come up with better methods of doing it. But it is a very exciting open area of right what's the right way to moderate to get it right. And right, so we'll get to this again in the next class, right? But right, this is a very nice article which actually talks about, right, limitations of Facebook's moderation. That here something we've also spoken about in the past, right? That ultimately, right, users might flag or whatever, but it's some centralized authority, right, which based on its own notions of what it calls community standards is making a decision of what to accept, what to reject, and so on. But rather, people will be more empowered if they can not just flag, but they can also, right, manage the content themselves, right? So this is what institutions do, right? So this article essentially says that if you build community institutions, if you give users the ownership to manage their own content, then they'll be able to do a better job. They'll be able to develop norms of their own. And this is actually what happens on Reddit. On Reddit, subreddits can create their own moderation norms, moderation policies. Right over there, things have been, many of these subreddits, therefore, are quite powerful in terms of, right, having good debates, free of like disinformation, right? So right, so again, right, giving more ownership to the users to involve them in this, in joint management, can be done, right? There are ways in which it can be done, but the question always is, how does that sit with Facebook's business model, right? Because exactly like this question that one of you asked right now, right, that you're essentially slowing down the speed of discussion, of content sharing and so on, and Facebook may not want that because less users will then engage, right? So the more regulated, the more closed that space is, it will therefore affect, right, how many users then engage with it. Yeah, cool. So let's stop now, and any questions, of course, we can keep discussing. Yeah. So next time we'll continue on this, and we look at, right. So we looked at content moderation, then, right, we will look a bit more on some of these things, right, in terms of governing platforms and so on, and then we look at some experiments, right, some ways in which, right, new policies are developed, like A/B testing mechanisms that especially social media platforms and all internet platforms do a lot these days. And what are some of the ethics with running these experiments to figure out how to govern platforms in a better way? So we look at that, right, and then we look at a bit more of, right, how can users self-manage content in a better way, right? So this will eventually then conclude, right, these 5 modules that we've been studying, right? Then we'll get into some other discussions.